The United Kingdom leaves the European Union this evening with a mixture of joy, anger and indifference. The UK's departure into the unknown is considered one of the biggest blows yet to Europe's attempt to forge unity from the ruins of World War II.
In the United Kingdom's most significant geopolitical move since it's lost its empire, the EU's most reluctant member prepared to exit an hour before midnight. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson was today chairing a cabinet meeting in Sunderland, the first city to declare a majority of votes for leaving the EU. Brexit supporters burned an EU flag outside Downing Street, where Prime Minister Boris Johnson lives. Some EU supporters were mocked by a larger group of Brexiteers nearby, chanting "Bye-bye EU" and "Shame on you" to the tune of Auld Lang Syne. At the stroke of midnight in Brussels, the EU will lose 15% of its economy, its biggest military spender, and the world's international financial capital, London. Johnson planned to celebrate with English sparkling wine and a distinctly British array of canapés, including Shropshire blue cheese and Yorkshire puddings with beef and horseradish. Europe's most powerful leader, Chancellor Angela Merkel, said it was a major turning point for the EU, but that Germany wanted to remain Britain's partner and friend. French President Emmanuel Macron was due to make a televised address to take note of a sad and historic day, to explain what Brexit means for France and to assure the French that he will defend French and EU interests in the upcoming negotiations. After 47 years of membership, the final parting is an anticlimax of sorts. Beyond the symbolism of the Union Jack flag being lowered at the European Council building in Brussels and put away with the flags of non-EU countries, little will change until the end of 2020. By then, Johnson has promised to strike a broad free trade agreement with the EU, the world's biggest trading bloc. Some Britons will celebrate and some will weep, but many will do neither. For proponents, Brexit is Independence Day, an escape from what they cast as a doomed German-dominated project with a doomed single currency that is failing its 500 million people. They hope departure will herald reforms to reshape Britain and propel it ahead of its European rivals. Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, used the moment to demand a second independence referendum.
Firstly, I will continue to do all that I can to secure a referendum this year. And that is for a reason. Brexit has put Scotland on the wrong road, and the further down that road we go, the longer it will take and the harder it will be to get back on the right one. We need back on the right road as soon as possible.
Brexiteers are expected to celebrate on Parliament Square as Britain begins charting a course for generations to come.
For more on the story, we are joined in studio by Dr. Malte Brosig. He is an Associate Professor in International Relations at the Department of International Relations at Wits University. Dr. Brosig, thank you for joining us this evening on The Globe.
Yeah, great being here. Thank you.
Now, Brexit is clearly a big victory for Boris Johnson. He is the man of the moment, and Brexiteers. Does this suggest that his reign is cemented for the next couple of years?
Somehow, yes. I mean, we have to look back a little bit at the very recent elections, and we've seen that he's the third Prime Minister in just a couple of years. Now he has a convincing majority and he has a strong majority in Parliament, so he can basically push through Brexit much quicker than it wasn't really possible only a couple of months ago, actually.
Now, Brexit is basically has divided the British public, and we've seen, jeers and cheers and mixed emotions, people not really, knowing how to feel. 47 years is a very long time, and just in the next couple of hours we'll be seeing that split. How do you see these divisions playing out going forward, given that Brexit is pretty much it's done and dusted, it's a done deal?
Not yet done. It's on the way, but the Brexit will come. That's very clear.
Yeah.
The referendum was almost 50-50, and it was under rather, slightly dubious conditions, actually, with a lot of manipulation. We have seen that the polarization in society actually increased after the referendum. However, I think once it sinks in that Brexit will come, to some extent, I think we will also see and slight ease in society. However, on the other side, we also know that in Scotland many people don't really like leaving the European Union, and these divisions I think will stay. And then there's still the issue with Northern Ireland and the Irish border, for example, because we don't know all the deals in the end, all the terms and conditions of how the UK is leaving. So I think there's still a lot of potential for inattentions.
Do you think that we're likely to see a split of the United Kingdom?
That is unlikely. That's very unlikely. I mean, Scotland cannot just hold a referendum, legally speaking, without consent of Westminster, and London already said no, there won't be a second referendum. So,
looking at the sentiment of Brexiteers, did you share the sentiments that the UK is better off independent from the EU?
To be honest, I think this is very often just an emotional question, not a rational question in the end. So identity politics play a very important role. If we just soberly look at economic data, then all economists are telling us that you would be better off in the European Union because it's a strong and large common market for example, and still we don't know all the details for the deal that has to be negotiated, for example, and that means there is still insecurity for business. Who wants to invest in Britain if you don't know if the country will stay in the common market or free trade area, for example. So that certainly puts quite a lot of limits on the economy.
And also, just speaking of free trade and now, being able to access markets like the United States, for instance, Australia, a lot of, trade has been going on between South Africa and the UK already. And obviously, there's a possibility or potential of more growth and other countries, including individual countries in the EU. What's your take on that?
Do you mean economically?
Economically, yes.
On the one hand, Britain was never really fully as integrated as many other continental countries. So if we look at the currency, for example, we're also in the manufacturing area. So the British economy is very strong in the financial and service sector. So from that perspective, it's easier to actually disconnect. But there are of course also sectors. Everyone who's active in the import and export business, global supply chains, for example, are hit very much. Also, the agricultural sector, I think, will not get the subsidies. Education, for example, research funding for UK universities. All this is still under doubt. It's not really clear how one will proceed here.
Now, we keep touching on the fact that it's somewhat a done deal. There's still the 11 months transition period with the possibility of an extension going forward, and the finer details being ironed out. What happens if there is no deal that is satisfactory to both parties, that is reached within the 11-month transition period, or even further than that?
Yeah, we've seen that deadlines have been moved
so
often.
Yes.
So I think we should expect maybe an extension of the extension here. However, there's still a threat of a no deal in the end, and the make or break point will be, will Britain get some extra conditions for being in the common market, for instance, and the questions are really rather technical here. And 11 months is not very long. I mean, it's a very technical, bureaucratic process that has to be worked out.
What about issues of security? Any upsides or downsides for the UK after Brexit?
Britain still is an essential member of NATO, for example, and security issues never figured as high in the European Union as economic questions, for example. But we've seen that defense integration and defense cooperation is actually growing in European countries, and this is something where Britain is not automatically part of anymore.
Now let's turn our attention to the EU. What does this divorce mean for the EU?
Well, it is a historic loss. I mean, there's no denying. I mean, when one of the largest and most important member states actually decides to leave, and the European Union always thinks about itself as being so attractive that others want to join. So that is something that really hits the heart of the organization and will have long-term consequences. That's for sure. Although I'm positive that there will be a final agreement and relations to the UK will be very friendly after all, but it will change the character of the European Union as well as the internal power dynamics.
Just speaking of power dynamics and the changes in terms of the power dynamics. During this 11-month transition period, they still have to adhere to the laws of the EU and the European Justice Court and abide by those laws. And, anything legal is still going to go through the EU and their decision making. And that, for the UK, is during that transition period. What happens thereafter?
That really depends on the deal.
On the deal, of course. But
and we don't know how that deal looks like.
possibilities.
But the option is, I mean, there's still the option of a no deal, right? And that would be economically, I think, damaging for both sides, and therefore it's not. I think it's not that likely that we'll have a no-deal exit here after all. But the question is one of, the compromises. If Britain wants to be part of the common market, but does not want to accept, for instance, environmental laws or labor laws that come in, and that is problematic from the European Union side. So compromises need to be found somewhere.
Now, with all of this taking place, there's the issues of citizenship. Some people have dual citizenship. What happens there? The travel. Will there be? Obviously, travel will change. Passports, we've already seen announcements of the colour of the passport changing, and the significance of that, to changing from the colour of the EU to the British colours, the UK colours. There's a huge significance. It's a serious breakaway, and how are people going to manage to transition, once it actually takes place?
I think that will be possible. First of all, Britain was never part of the Schengen group, so there was always a border control. But one also has to think about British citizens then in the European Union.
Yes.
So you wanted to think it both ways, actually. So I guess that's maybe a minor issue after all. I mean, I don't think there will be a visa regime or people have to apply for complicated permits and so on. But the details will be quite interesting. I mean, the Brexiteers always campaigned also on migration issues, so they want to control migration also from European countries. But we also know that the British economy also needs migration to actually keep the hospitals running, for example, where there are many
health
foreigners.
insurance,
yes,
for
absolutely,
instance, yes. With health insurance, the impact of that, the fact that UK citizens now are not going to be able to have access to health insurance in the EU bloc, like
at least not so easily.
Not
for
easily,
example,
yes.
yeah.
There's issues of driver's license. These are things that people may take for granted, but once they are in a situation, the
problem
reality
starts if there is no legal coverage for all this anymore, and if there's no deal for it, then the question is what rules actually apply. But I think there's still such a scary environment that in the end politicians will settle on some kind of common sense solution here.
Now, what does this all mean for South Africa and perhaps broadly the African continent? This is huge. It opens up a lot of possibilities in terms of trade, trade deals. Already South Africa has been doing a lot of trade with the UK and the EU, of course. But what does this really mean in terms of the nitty-gritty?
It depends. I mean, some African countries have only very like minor trade volumes with the United Kingdom. So from their perspective, not that much would actually change. But those countries, those African countries that have larger trade volumes, they are actually, you know, what they're doing is basically wait and see. This is what everyone is doing in the end, because it depends on how the UK leaves the European Union. But there might be also options where the UK is very closely still linked to the European economies, and maybe it doesn't really require much rethinking about new trade deals, for example.
So now with possibilities, let's speak about possibilities now. Say the transition period comes and it goes, we see an extension, as we've seen, it's taken a very long time, just over 3 years to finalize this, or somewhat finalize it. The possibilities of what UK citizens may be look forward to in terms of going forward.
That is a
I know.
That is a difficult question to
you know, we have to, you know,
to answer.
Yeah.
I think the interesting question will be in the end, you know, once Brexit really kicks in, what will be the consequences and who is bearing the cost of all of this? The estimation that I've seen is that Brexit will cost the UK economy around £200 billion until the end of this year. But we don't have Brexit right now. It's still coming,
It's still
right? The
coming.
major part
Yes.
is still coming. So it's, of course, it's also extremely speculative in one way or the other. But the interesting question for me is how these costs will be distributed down the line. Actually, who is paying the bill in the end? And this will have maybe also political consequences in the long run. But from the statistics also, at the moment, the average population doesn't really feel the Brexit. So we still have unemployment actually going down, declining, for example. Also wages are stable here and there. So the real effect is not yet felt by the population. But I guess at some point that might change.
Reality will kick in and those effects will be felt eventually. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Brosig, and we will be watching. It's a developing story. The whole world is watching, and I think, you know, we'll definitely touch base with you at a later stage to discuss this further. Thank you for your time.